What did you make of the government's decision to push off to a committee? I'd expect it to go to a committee, but I'm surprised it didn't go through the House first in times of this. The bill normally goes through the House. It's a religious freedom because the government's under pressure to get it done before the election. If they don't get it through the House, then the committee. If they hold it up, the voting for the committee, I don't think it's going to pass before an election in May. It was a key commitment of Morrison at the last election, but the moderates wouldn't have a bar of it, even though all the moderates out there said to the Australian public with the plebiscite, you've got to trust us, vote for it, you'll get your religious freedom. But they weren't prepared to do that for the Prime Minister. What did you make of that?
Well, I think it's a sign of the declining authority of the Prime Minister, sad to say, and also this is a government, a little bit like Malcolm Fraser at the end, that shows how old I am, which is outsmarted by its own tactics. Why on earth is the Religious Freedom Bill being presented to Parliament at 1 minute to midnight? Why has the government been unwilling to argue this case? You know, politics, the modern Conservative tries to win by not having a position on anything and hoping that the natural aversion to the chaos of Labor will keep them in government forever. But, you know, you won't win an argument like religious freedom or the nature of the federal anti-corruption body or anything else unless you're willing to engage in the argument. I mean, every reform, John Howard on GST, Bob Hawke on deregulating the labour market, you had to go out and have an argument and beat your opponents, polarise the electorate and win 50% plus one. But honestly, I thought the government had completely abandoned the religious freedom law the last 12 months because you never heard a word of it. And here we are on the last day of Parliament this year, and who knows, perhaps the last day of Parliament before an election is not inconceivable. We still don't have the legislation presented. Now, that does lead you to become very cynical. I agree with your political analysis. Much better to force Labor to vote on it so they have to go on the record of it. But this is right across the board with the government. Why hasn't it produced half a dozen big defence equipment purchases? Real things, not subs in 100 years, real things now. Air warfare destroyers, extra planes, all kinds of things, and then get Labor to either endorse all that expenditure or run away from it. Why hasn't it promoted its own model of an integrity commission and so on and so on?
It's because I want to get onto your book. I want to get onto your book, but I want to tell people at home it's because there's a breakdown in the process, the organisational engine room of the government and the Cabinet Office and the public service, because you queue these things up, and while they're all focused on the pandemic, that was all that mattered. And there wasn't anyone that I can see driving the other ministers who weren't in the eye of the storm like Greg Hunt to keep their agenda moving, to keep it moving through Cabinet. I mean, that bill should have been introduced in the Parliament so that in the interregnum of the last few weeks when Parliament wasn't sitting, the committee hearing could have been held, it could have been reported on, voted on this week. You've got to get Labor on the sticky paper on things like religious freedom. But I mean, they're all ideas, but there's no action behind some of this stuff. But let's get on to that book because Christmas is looming and it's a bestseller. It's your second bestseller. Congratulations. Christians, the urgent case for Jesus in the world. Talk to me about the treatment of Christians and Christianity in popular culture, Greg, because you really go hard on this issue in the book.
Well, Peter, you know, it's a joy to talk to you about this. And one reason I love writing about Christianity is because I can actually be positive about it, whereas there's almost nothing in foreign affairs or politics that I can really be positive about. The culture, you might think the West almost has a suicide wish at the moment. The culture is turning its back on Christianity very comprehensively. One reason for writing this book is that as a result of that, there's a certain crisis of knowledge. Very few people now even really know what the content of Christianity is, what its supernatural and metaphysical and human claims are. But one of my favourite chapters in the book, one that I had most fun writing, was about the treatment of Christianity in popular culture. And I can see a little bit of a comeback. You know, there are these wonderful TV series like Jane the Virgin and Blue Bloods, and there's some terrific films and so on, which are a bit more pro-Christian than things were 10 years ago. And I think that's because the culture has become so non-Christian. It's gone from being post-Christian to being pre-Christian, which means it's kind of a little bit open to the Christian message again. But it is just such a great story and so compelling, the Christian story, that even if you don't believe it, you want to be acquainted with it, I would think.
What about broadly across the West, though, Greg? I mean, is Christianity in a state of sort of terminal decline? We know a lot of the growth in Christian churches is outside of the West. Can it be arrested, do you think, in the West?
Yeah, it's not terminal, Peter. In fact, it's been in much worse shape a number of times before. In 1750, at St Paul's Cathedral in London, 14 or 15 people turned up to the Easter services, and there were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets of London. Then along came the Wesleys and Wilberforce, and there was a tremendous revival of Christianity. Same in Australia. There have been times when the practice rates are lower than now. But a couple of other points about it. Outside of the West, Christianity is absolutely booming. There are 2 chapters in this book about Christians in China. And, you know, Christianity has grown in China from 4 million when the communists took over to maybe 100 million now. It's a bit hard to get the figure exactly precise. These are people enduring infinitely worse circumstances than any Western Christian is, and yet Christianity is on fire in China. It's the one social force the Chinese Communist Party cannot control. Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world, in Asia, you know, in countries like Pakistan, in the Middle East, in Africa, and yet in all those places it's booming. So I don't think we should be pessimistic in the West. And there are new movements, some of which I outline in this book. This brilliant young woman, Frances Cantrell, who runs the Culture Project. There are new movements in Christianity, some of the Pentecostals with their grip on popular culture and so on. So the Christian church in 20 years is going to look a bit different than it did when I was a kid, or even more recently when you were a kid. But there are a lot of green shoots, a lot of life there. And we must never fall for the idea of of the critics of Christianity who say, well, that's over, the West is finished with that now.
All right, well, that's a book to get for Christmas, isn't it? Greg Sheridan, thank you for your time as always. Have a lovely Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year.